Hello, everyone. Welcome to Coffee and a Book. My name is William Hemsworth. It's great to be with you this week. Thank you for joining me. My guest at this time is author and speaker Steve Christie. He's the author of a interesting new book called "Why Protestant Bibles Are Smaller: A Defense of the Protestant Old Testament Canon." Steve, how are you doing today?
Doing well. How are you, William? How are things in Arizona?
Arizona's doing great. I know we've been corresponding on email. I grew up in Los Angeles. I got stationed here in 2001. My wife and I love Arizona. So how about you? Where you're at?
I'm actually in Toledo, Ohio, which is in northwest Ohio. We're a couple hours ahead of you, I believe. So
Right.
your time would probably be around 1 o'clock, I believe.
That's right. Yeah, we don't do daylight savings time. So half the time we're on mountain time, half the time we're on Pacific time. So
Oh, wow.
sometimes it throws us off a little bit.
Right.
But congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
It's got a lot of reception. Actually, the funny part, it's got a lot more reception than my first book, which was more ecumenical and more friendly. Let's put it that way. And the reception has actually surprisingly been more in the Catholic audience than a Protestant audience. So it just kind of shows you that God has his timetable and way of doing things.
right. I know you've done some debates with Gary Machuda, with Trent Horn about why Protestant Bibles are smaller. Those debates are great. I love the way how you all interacted with each other. It was very cordial. So thumbs up on that. Now, maybe you can tell our audience what's the difference between Protestant Bibles and Catholic Bibles? Can we
Right.
start off there?
Well, sure. Well, they both agree on the same 27 book New Testament, and they actually agree on the same books that are known as the Hebrew Bible or the Proto-Canon. There's 39 books in the Protestant Old Testament that Catholics actually agree with. But the difference, as you know, are the 7 extra books that are in Catholic Old Testaments and the Greek additions to Esther and Daniel that Catholics refer to as Deuterocanon or Second Canon.
Right, and Protestants would refer to it too as Apocrypha for the audience who may have heard that term before. Now,
Right.
now I'm a Catholic, and I'm really glad that you emailed me about this topic because it's one that obviously we're both passionate about. But
Right.
from a history perspective, well, let me back up. Why did you decide to write the book?
The reason I decided to write the book because it was actually one of the first topics that really I was interested in after I converted from being a Catholic to being a Protestant in August of 2004. I was raised Catholic, had a wonderful upbringing. I graduated from a Catholic college, and then a few years later, I ran into a Catholic monk at a Barnes and Noble store, and the best way to describe him would be a sedevacantist, where he believed that the
Okay.
Church of Peter was empty since Vatican II, and that was one of the issues that was brought up when we were talking. And I never saw the guy again, and it was just something that I had always been interested in. And then later on, Trent Horn actually had a podcast or whatever on Catholic Answers where he asked, why aren't you Catholic? And that was one of the things that I called in about. And he made the comment, well, rather than asking why are Catholic Bibles bigger, perhaps we should ask why are Protestant Bibles smaller? I'm thinking, wow, that would be a good topic of a book, and the rest they say is history.
Okay, so it's not a play on Gary Machuda's book then, like you.
No, what's actually funny, I found out about the title of Gary Machuda's book after I, came up with that. And so what I did is I just switched a couple of the words, but it was the exact same word. So it's kind of ironic.
Now, in the book, you start off your case with the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe walk us through that? Now, you talk about Paul's argumentation and everything else. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, actually, we can actually begin with Jesus himself in Luke
Okay.
chapter 16. It's where he's talking with the Pharisees, and he says that the law and the prophets were proclaimed until John the Baptist, and he said that the money-loving Pharisees were listening to everything that he was talking about. And then he goes on to tell the parable of the rich man and the 5 brothers, who are reflective and symbolic of these money-loving Pharisees. And he goes on to say they, referring to the Pharisees, have Moses and the prophets, which is a term to describe the Old Testament because the New Testament hadn't been written yet. And the specific Greek word have is where we get our English word echo. It's a transliteration, and it literally means to have possession of something. So he's saying that the Pharisees have possession of the Old Testament. And the question is, what were those books that the Pharisees had possession of? Well, and if you go back to Luke chapter 11, when he's talking with the Pharisees and he says, they're sitting in the seat of Moses, and then he goes on rebuking them, and then he says about how you had murdered the righteous prophets from Abel to Zechariah, and he's drawing from an already established canon where, with Abel being at the very beginning of the first book of the Old Testament, and Zechariah being the very end of the Old Testament, specifically in Second Chronicles. And I start piecing that, as well as the Apostle Paul, in where he uses the same term, the law and the prophets, in Romans chapter 2, and he says that the oracles of God were entrusted to the Jews. And then he goes on, he cites the Psalms and Isaiah, and he describes them as the law and the prophets.
Okay. Now, in the time of Jesus, and I know you address this in your book, because some would say there were different canons floating around during the time of Christ. And so how do we know which one was the right one? You know, with the Septuagint and everything else. Maybe you can cover what the Septuagint is and why you don't think that is the correct scriptures that we have today.
Yeah, and when we say Septuagint, it's kind of a misnomer. It's more of a Septuaginta. I mean, there are different versions of the Septuagint that were around in the early church. For example, as I mentioned in the book, we found 23 Greek versions of the Septuagint that had books like Third Esdras, Third and Fourth Maccabees, and other books that aren't found in Catholic or Protestant Old Testaments. But when we think Septuagint, we tend to think of the Greek translation, the Old Testament. In reality, it actually began a translation of the 5 books of Moses, and then slowly over time, it included the books that Catholics and Protestants both agree, are inspired scripture and part of the Old Testament. And when we actually look into the New Testament, whenever they cite them specifically as scripture and draw from the Septuagint with terms like "it is written," "have you not read," I started discovering that they only do that with the books from the Protestant Old Testament, but they don't do that with books from the Catholic Old Testament, including books that are alluded to, very frequently, like Wisdom and Sirach, First and Second Maccabees. They allude to them, but not specifically as scripture with one of these formulas.
Okay. So what would you do, for example, for like not Wisdom chapter 2, for example, that has the prophecy about Jesus? How would you address that? Sometimes that's an
Yeah,
objection. That's why I ask.
no, that's actually a good objection. It's one that frequently comes up. In fact, it did actually come up in both of my debates with Gary and Trent. And as I pointed out to them, if you actually read Wisdom chapter 2, when it's talking about basically the future Messiah being freed, from their enemies, it's believed that it's a prophecy of Matthew chapter 27. But if you actually look at chapter 27, the phrase that's in Wisdom chapter 2 that talks about being freed or whatever from the enemies, that's only found in Wisdom chapter 2. That's actually not found in Matthew chapter 27. Rather, if you read the whole of Matthew chapter 27, it's actually a reflection back of the prophecy in Psalm chapter 22. And in fact, the New American Bible and the New Catholic Version, which is actually an older version, actually references back to Psalm chapter 22. So Wisdom chapter 2, what it's doing is actually it's reflecting back to the prophecy in Psalm 22 and then adding on that little tag at the very end that's not found in Matthew chapter 27.
Okay. Now, in your book, you deal with a lot about you deal a lot about with history. I mean, you go into the early church fathers, you go into the early councils, and of course, as a Catholic, that's what we would reference as proof text as well. Can you go through the early church fathers and say why that's not proof of the Deuterocanon?
Right. Yeah. Well, there's very little list in the early church, and a lot of that has to do with the Roman persecution. There's a lot of things, including complete Bibles that were destroyed and stuff.
Right.
But the list that we do have from antiquity, both from early Jews like Josephus and some early church fathers like Melito and Origen and others, when you see these early lists, you tend to see lists that are more reflective of the later Protestant Old Testament. Like, for instance, Melito cites every one of the books of the Protestant Old Testament except for Esther. And there's some historical and theological reasons, for that. But that's really the exception that proves the rule, because just a little while later, Origen, he cites every one of the books of the Protestant Old Testaments. Now, what people point out is that his list doesn't include the minor prophets, but the minor prophets were never considered to be in question, in the early church or within early Judaism. And as Beckwith points out in his book, later on, Origen makes a commentary on the minor prophets, and Hilary of Poitiers later references this list, not only the exact books, but also the order of the books, including the minor prophets, which he places before Isaiah. So if you would like to say with an exact complete list, Origen would probably be the earliest, and Melito in the 2nd century would probably be the next closest.
For those that may be wondering, why was Esther excluded in that first list?
That's actually a really good question, and there's a lot of guesswork, and I want to focus on that. Part of it is that we don't find the Book of Esther listed in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is believed to have been written by the Essenes, although there was a book called Proto-Esther, which was kind of a commentary on the Book of Esther. So we have to be careful about saying that they rejected. As my friend Trent Horn would say, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But there might have been an issue where they would have had a problem with Esther being married to a pagan king, which, although there are some other books, like Ruth was married, to a Jew, and Ruth was pagan as well, so, and also Esther, at least the Hebrew version of Esther doesn't include the name of God at all in the first 10 chapters, which might explain why the later Greek writer of Esther, which was written centuries later, mention him, and they mention him quite a bit. I think I had counted something like 45 times in 107 verses. So it goes from none, to a lot. Just so that might have actually been an issue as well. And the later Jewish church, in the 2nd century, might have taken some issues with that. And then there's also been talk about the fact that the Essenes would have had a solar calendar as opposed to a lunar calendar, and they wouldn't have had Jewish holidays necessarily on the Sabbath, and Purim, which is found in Esther, would have fallen on the Sabbath. So those theories as well. So, or it could have just been something inadvertent, because I think we preserved Melito through Eusebius. So Eusebius, it could have been something as simple as he inadvertently omitted it, like he inadvertently omitted the minor prophets from Origen's list.
Okay. So there's a lot that goes into it. So I was just curious for those that may be listening. Now let's fast forward a couple hundred years to the councils. Council of Rome, Hippo, Carthage, where there's listings of the canon. Now your book has a very interesting. You list the differences there, and I really appreciated that. Can you go over maybe what those books were listed, what the differences are, how that fits into your hypothesis?
Certainly. It's commonly believed that the 4th century councils, specifically of Rome, Hippo, and Carthage, produced an identical list. And although they produce most of the list, including the books that are in the Deuterocanon, what you find is that Rome, as opposed I got you back.
Yep, we're back. Sorry about that.
That's all right. We'll find out how much of this went through and how much didn't. But anyways, Hippo and Carthage, unlike Baruch or unlike the Council of Rome, they would have drawn from the Greek translation of the Septuagint. And back then, the Greek Septuagint would have included a book called First Esdras. Today, we consider First Esdras to be the single book of Ezra, and Second Esdras would be the single book of Nehemiah. But drawing from the Septuagint back then, First Esdras would have been an additional work which included the last 2 chapters from Second Chronicles, most of the book of Ezra, half a chapter of Nehemiah, but also 2.5 chapters that aren't found in Catholic Old Testaments today. Now, fast forward to like the Council of Trent. By that time, they would have considered First Esdras to be Ezra, Second Esdras to be a Nehemiah. So the nomenclature, was different between the two. So that's where the councils had different lists. They weren't identical.
Okay. Now, how about Saint Jerome? I know this,
Okay.
sometimes, like while when I was interviewing Gary Machuda, Saint Jerome initially denied the Deuterocanon, but later on he acquiesced, if you will. What are your views on that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, he always like appealed like a lot of early Catholics and, to the church and everything, but he
Right.
made it a very clear point of making the distinction between books that were ecclesiastical or like church books and books that were canonical. And actually, Augustine did the same thing on his work on Christian doctrine. Um, but they still included it under the umbrella of the Old Testament. They put it in event, and those books did eventually end up in Jerome's translation. But when Jerome was appealing to the Hebrew scriptures, because he wanted to get as many books from the Hebrew Bible as possible in the original language, he could only find the books from the proto-canon, but he couldn't find the Deuterocanon in the Hebrew. So he had to go to the Septuagint. Well, when he went to the Septuagint, he could find all the books from the Deuterocanon except for Baruch, which is something we find out later in a later work, which the name of it is leaving me right now. But it was like the official study Bible of Catholic theologians in the latter Middle Ages, which states that it was not in Jerome's Vulgate at the time because he couldn't find it in the Septuagint.
Okay. How about later when, like, Tobit, for example, was found in Hebrew?
Yeah.
What,
Well, that's great that it was found in Hebrew. And
sure.
historically, I know there's been a lot of Protestants who have said that, well, he didn't like the fact that Jerome couldn't find it in Hebrew. And so that was kind of a disqualifier.
Mhm.
Well, just because something is written in a particular language, it doesn't necessarily mean it is or it is not scripture, so like it says, and with what's his name, Luther, he drew on Jerome, but Luther also realized that the Targums, which are Aramaic paraphrases of the Old Testament, he could find virtually all the books of the Hebrew Bible from that, but he couldn't find any of the books, including Tobit, in Aramaic paraphrases. And a lot of times when you look at the New Testament commentators will draw on the Aramaic Targums, as evidence of what it is and what is not scripture.
Okay. Now, a moment ago, you had mentioned Augustine and
Mm-hmm.
the Deuterocanon, and you talked a lot about. I can't talk right now. I'm sorry, Steve. You talked a lot about that in your book. Can you maybe give us an overview of what Augustine thought about the books, or maybe what he would not have thought about the books?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, he made the comment that these were books that were ecclesiastical, meaning these were church books, and but he did not consider them to be canonical. And again, like it says, there's a difference between canonical, meaning books that are inspired Old Testament, and books that are ecclesiastical, which are edifying to the church, but not necessarily to be inspired books. And he had made the comment that he had believed that the books of Maccabees were, can't remember if he said that they were or they were not in the writings of or in the canon of the Jews, but they were or were not in the canon of the church at the time. So that's really significant because it was a belief that he held that we now realize is not true.
Okay. And then, of course, you go through like Gregory the First. You go through a lot of history. Was it over
Mm-hmm.
600 citations, something like that, that you have in the
Well,
book?
yeah, well, if you're talking about my book, I have over 630 references in the book. About 60% of them are from Catholic resources, and in fact, I even cite the Vatican a few times. And I cite early and contemporary Catholic authors, such as Charles Joseph Van Heffley, who is a Catholic historian that talked even about the 4th century councils. I cite Eusebius. I mentioned Melito, Origen, Pope Gregory the Great, Cardinal Cajetan, Ximenes, Erasmus, so mostly Catholic sources, because, as opposed to Protestant sources, because then you have that sense of bias that's there.
Right. And I'm glad you did that because, I mean, And the last thing I think any of us wants to do is erect a straw man that's easily knocked down. So I think that's a really good thing that you did with the book. So I congratulate you on that. I applaud that. So you've had a couple debates. What has been the response overall from the book? I know you said you had a lot of good response from Catholics, which you
Yeah.
found surprising. What's some of the feedback?
It's actually kind of funny because when you're doing a debate, especially online, you cannot see the comments that people are making, which is probably a good thing because my mother actually watched it and she says she was distracted from the comments because they were less than genuine, towards
Uh,
me. But I'm like, you know what, you're going to get that on both sides too. You're going to get Protestants, knocking Catholics as well. So I was expecting that, and honestly, I just brush that off my shoulder, no big deal. But before, you're familiar with Catholic Answers, and
right.
their forum just went down at the end of the year. I don't know if you're aware of that or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I was actually on there. It was kind of like as a ghostwriter. I was known as Raised Catholic, and that was on there. And I
I've
was
seen
listening.
you.
Oh, you see me? Yeah, that was me.
All
That was
right.
me. Yeah. So, anyways, and I was reading the comments and stuff, and a lot of them were genuine, and some of them were disingenuous, no big deal. But then there was a Catholic that was on there. His name's Dolphin. I have no idea who he is, but it's very clear he was a Catholic from a lot of his responses. And he had made the comment. He says that he really loves Trent Horn, and he thought he did a really good job against this one atheist that he had recently, a debate that he had with him. And he says, but I'm afraid that he lost this debate, referring to the debate with me. And when you see a Catholic saying that a Catholic won, you expect that. When you see a Protestant saying that you think the Protestant won the debate, you expect that too. But it was encouraging to me that a devout Catholic who loves Trent Horn and follows him saying, I think that Trent lost this debate. That was encouraging to me
Yeah.
because I've talked to other Protestants, like my friend Jeff Robinson from A Goy for Jesus, who did a post-debate interview with me that I think I might have mentioned at one time, and
Yep.
he's made individual clips on his website, which is on my YouTube channel as well. Um, but when someone who's actually opposed to you makes a comment like that, that shows objectivity.
No, and that's a good thing. We all have to keep open minds and be open to other ideas. So what's next as far as getting the message out about the book? I know it's a little hard now with the whole COVID situation, but what's next for the book?
Well, like it says, I've had the privilege of actually, traveling to different churches in Ohio as well as Michigan. So I do visit churches and do public speaking there for the book. I've been fortunate to be on Christian radio, Christian television, like my local Christian TV station, had interviewed me about the book, and just having interviews, with people like yourself, as well, and being in debates like this is with Gary and Trent, which I was privileged to do. In fact, they indirectly sought me out, which I felt humbled about. When people you mention in your book want to debate you, it's a very humbling experience, especially people of the caliber of Gary Machuda and Trent Horn, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for both of them.
Right. Now, one more thing before a couple more things before, because our time together here is running a little short. But you touch upon Eastern Orthodoxy in your book as well, because their canon is different from the other two we've been talking about.
Right.
Can you discuss that for us?
Yeah, like it says, they contain books that are in their canon that aren't in Catholic or Protestant Bibles. One of them being Third Esdras, which was in the canon in the fourth century councils of Hippo and Trent, or Hippo and Carthage, which were also in the Septuagint, back in that time. And these books are books that, in the future, I know Trent Horn says that the Catholic Church might consider adding if they ever reconciled with. With the East at some point, because they're books of antiquity and they qualify and stuff, and if a magisterium or a future ecumenical council would deem that, and that's something that triggered me, because it's like, well, that would mean that the Old Testament canon of Catholics is potentially not closed and is potentially open, and not including books that Jesus would have considered to be inspired, if that's true or not. So with Protestants, our canon is closed just as it was 500 years ago. It'll be closed 500 years from now with the same books.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have any other books in the works?
I'm sorry.
Do you have any other books that you plan on writing about the subject?
Yeah, I wasn't planning on writing this one. It was just something that just kind of, just like my first book, I hadn't planned on writing that one either. So I guess whatever direction the Lord decides, to take me, whether it's another book on the canon or another issue, I like to, when I write books, want to write books where there's a need and there's an interest and something that definitely affects the church. And this is something that affects the church. It's important because whatever the canon is, Jesus is not going to give his church a canon that's incomplete, either with too many books that aren't scripture or to omit books that are scripture. So it's an important issue whether you're Protestant, Catholic, or anything else.
Okay. Now you mentioned your first book. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
Yeah, it's titled "Not Really of Us: Why Do Children of Christian Parents Abandon the Faith?" And it explains from a biblical perspective why kids grow up Christian and why they walk away from it later. Like for instance, I was raised a very devout, happy Catholic, and I walked away from it. And when I came back, I came back to the Protestant church. And there's a lot of reasons that they give, and I give kind of a top 10 reason why they leave, and kind of a top 10 way of dealing with individual, because they give individual reasons why they walked away, but the Apostle John actually says it clearly, the main reason why they walk away in 1 John chapter 5. I think it's chapter 5 or chapter 2 verse 19, where he says they went out from us because they were not really of us. And the reason they walk away isn't because they left the church or lost their salvation, but it's because they say they were never really Christians to begin with. And this is something that I found with kids that grow up later. The reason they says, I really didn't believe it. I believed it because my parents believed it. And I use the parable of the 4 soils from Matthew chapter 13, where he breaks it down, individual reasons why they walk away.
Okay. Where can our listeners learn more about you and buy your books?
Yeah. If they want to get the book directly, they can go on Amazon.com and then just type in "Why Protestant Bibles Are Smaller," and actually Gary's book pops up in the list as well. I have a YouTube channel, Born Again RN. I'm a registered nurse, so you can remember it that way. And that's my username on Facebook and Twitter as well.
Great. Well, Steve, I thank you for taking some time to join us on Coffee and a Book, and look forward to having you on my other programs so we can delve a little deeper into this topic.
I look forward to that. And thank you for having me on, William, and God bless you.
Oh, God bless you too.